I was 63 years old, bone-tired in a way that only caregivers understand, and I was smiling at my wife like a fool who had no idea his entire life was built on sand. That morning, a Tuesday in early November, nothing special about it. I had helped her sit up in bed the same way I had every morning for 4 years. I adjusted the pillow behind her back. I checked the catheter. I said, "Good morning," the way you say good morning to someone who might or might not hear you, and she looked at me the way she always did. Eyes open, breathing slow, present in the room but somewhere else entirely at the same time. I didn't understand yet. I told myself I was at peace with not understanding. I was wrong about that too. Her name was my wife's name, and I had loved her for 31 years. I need you to hold on to that number. 31 years. Because everything that came after only makes sense if you understand how much history a person can be carrying when the floor drops out. We met when I was 32 and she was 29. I was teaching high school history in Wilmington, North Carolina. She managed the front office at a pediatric clinic 2 blocks from the school, and I used to walk by every afternoon on my way to the parking lot. One September, she was standing outside on her lunch break, eating a sandwich and reading a paperback, and she looked up and said, "You walk too fast for a man with nowhere to be." I stopped. I asked her how she knew I had nowhere to be. She said, "Because men who have somewhere to be don't look out of the window the whole time they're walking." She was right. I had been looking in at her for 3 weeks. We were married 11 months later. We had 2 boys. We built a life that, from the outside, looked exactly like what it was. Ordinary, decent, and deeply loved by both of us. The stroke happened on a Wednesday afternoon. She was 58. She collapsed in the kitchen while she was making dinner, and by the time the ambulance came, she had lost movement on her entire left side. The doctors at Cape Fear Medical were honest with us from the beginning. The damage was significant. Recovery could happen, but it would be slow, and we needed to prepare for the possibility that it wouldn't be complete. I told them I was prepared. I wasn't, but I told them that. She came home 6 weeks later in a wheelchair. Our younger boy, he was living in Charlotte by then, drove down to help me set up the bedroom. We rented a hospital bed. We installed grab bars in the bathroom. We rearranged our entire first floor around her limitations, and I told myself it was temporary. That was the story I kept telling. For 4 years, I was her caregiver. I want to say that clearly and without drama, because people sometimes make caregiving sound like either sainthood or martyrdom, and it was neither. It was just what you do when you love someone. I bathed her and dressed her and managed her medications and made every meal and drove her to every appointment. I read to her in the evenings because the television tired her eyes. I learned how to do her hair the way she liked it. I learned which nurses at the neurology office were worth talking to, and which ones just wanted to get you out the door. I learned more about the autonomic nervous system than any former history teacher should ever need to know. What I didn't learn, what I was not paying enough attention to learn, was what was happening in the rest of the house. My wife had a younger brother. He had always been difficult in the particular way that charming men are difficult. He could make you feel like the most important person in a room, and then you'd realize later that you couldn't remember a single thing he'd actually said. He was 3 years younger than her, worked in real estate development, and had been borrowing money from my wife on and off since before we were married. She never said no to him. That was the one thing we disagreed about in 30 years. I said once, early in our marriage, that her brother had a hole in him that no amount of money was ever going to fill. She cried. I never said it again. After the stroke, he started coming around more. At the time, I took it as the grief response it appeared to be. His sister was incapacitated. He was being a good brother. He brought groceries sometimes. He sat with her on Sunday afternoons so I could take a walk or run an errand. I was grateful. I was stupid with exhaustion, and I was grateful for any help I could get, and that gratitude blinded me to things I should have seen. My wife's father had died 18 months before her stroke. He had been a quiet, careful man. A retired machinist from Fayetteville who had spent 40 years building a modest portfolio of savings in 2 rental properties that were worth considerably more by the time he died than they had been when he bought them. He left everything to his 2 children equally. My wife's half, combined with the investments we'd built together, meant that between the two of us we had accumulated something in the range of $800,000 in assets, not counting the house. For a retired school teacher and a clinic manager in North Carolina, that was a significant amount. We had talked about it. What to leave the boys, what to do with the properties, whether to sell or hold. We had an attorney. We had documents. Or we thought we did. The phone call that changed everything came from a doctor I had never met. His name was Dr. Fennick, and he was a neurologist at a research hospital in Durham. He had been referred my wife's case by her regular neurologist as part of a study on post-stroke recovery outcomes. He asked if he could come see her in person. I said of course. He came on a Thursday afternoon in March. He was younger than I expected. Mid-40s, soft-spoken, the kind of doctor who actually sits down before he starts talking. He did a thorough examination, about 40 minutes, and I waited in the kitchen. When he came out, he did not sit down. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, and he looked at me with the expression that I now recognize as a doctor trying to calculate exactly how much of what he knows he is obligated to say. "Mr. Braddock," he said, "how long has your wife been in this condition?" I told him 4 years, almost to the month. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to ask you a direct question, and I need you to hear it as a medical question and not as an accusation." I said, "Go ahead. Has anyone reviewed her medication regimen in the last 2 years with fresh eyes? Not her regular team? Someone outside the care loop?" I said no. I said her neurologist had been managing her case since the beginning, and I had trusted him completely. Dr. Fennick nodded. He sat down then. He put his folder on the table, and he looked at me and said, "The level of sedation present in your wife's system is not consistent with standard post-stroke care protocol. It is consistent with deliberate, ongoing pharmacological suppression." He paused. "I think you need to call the police." I remember the refrigerator humming. I remember the afternoon light on the kitchen floor. I remember thinking, very clearly, that I had heard him wrong. I had not heard him wrong. The next 72 hours are both the clearest and the most fragmented of my life. I remember pieces, calling my older son, who drove from Raleigh in 2.5 hours. I remember the police coming. 2 officers at first, and then a detective named Gale, who was my age, and had been with the county department for 20 years, and had the particular exhausted patience of someone who had seen exactly this thing before, even if the details were always different. The toxicology results came back within 48 hours of my wife being transferred to Durham. The sedative compound in her system was not something that appeared in any of her prescribed medications. It had been administered separately in small regular doses over what the hospital estimated was somewhere between 18 months and 2 years. 18 months to 2 years. I had to sit with that number for a long time before I could make it mean anything. Someone had been drugging my wife, in my home, in her bed, while I was in the next room reading to her, making her soup, believing I was caring for her. Someone had been keeping her more impaired than her stroke alone would have made her. Someone had needed her quiet and compliant and unable to communicate clearly for 1.5 years. For reasons I was about to find out, the detective came back on a Saturday. She brought a younger detective with her, and they sat at my kitchen table and explained what they had found. I want to be careful here about what I say, because these were my wife's family members, and even now I find it difficult to describe without feeling like I am doing something that cannot be undone. But the truth is the truth. Her brother had been, with the assistance of a notary in Wilmington who is now facing his own charges, gradually transferring my wife's assets into accounts under his control. The process had begun, they believed, about 6 months after her stroke, when she was still in early recovery, still confused, still highly dependent, still legally and emotionally vulnerable. He had needed her signatures on certain documents. Several of those documents had been signed during what the detective described as a period when my wife would not have had the cognitive capacity to understand what she was signing. The pharmacological suppression had come later, they believed, as an additional layer of security, to prevent her from recovering to a degree where she might communicate concerns to me or to anyone else. By the time Dr. Fennick walked into my house, my wife's brother had transferred approximately $430,000 in assets. The 2 rental properties from her father's estate had been sold, and the proceeds moved through 3 different accounts. He had stolen his own sister's inheritance. He had drugged her. He had done it while I was taking care of her in the next room, while I was reading to her, while I believed with my whole exhausted heart that I was doing everything right. There was a moment, I remember it exactly, which I find strange because memory in grief is usually so unreliable, when the detective showed me a photograph of one of the bank account documents. My wife's signature was on it. Shaky, not like her regular handwriting, but there. I traced it with my finger before I realized what I was doing. 31 years. That with her handwriting. Even drugged and confused and frightened, whatever she was at that moment, it was still her handwriting. I left the table and went into the backyard and stood in the cold for about 15 minutes. No one came after me. I think the detective understood. Her brother was arrested 4 days later at his home in Jacksonville. He did not resist. He had apparently been aware for some time that the situation was unraveling. A former colleague of his notary had grown suspicious and made an inquiry to the county clerk's office in a moment of conscience that my wife's attorney later said probably saved us from losing the rest. When the police came, her brother opened the door and sat down on his own couch and waited. His attorney issued a statement saying his client intended to cooperate fully. I did not watch the news coverage. His wife, my sister-in-law, a woman I had known for 22 years, who had been at my dinner table more times than I could count, called me the night before the arraignment. I answered without thinking. She was crying before I said a word. She said she hadn't known. She said the financial part. She had wondered sometimes, but she hadn't known about the medication. She had not known about the medication. I believed her. I still do. I'm not sure that made anything easier, but I believed her. My wife's recovery, once she was off the suppressant compound, was slow and not complete, and more than the doctors had initially allowed themselves to promise. The underlying stroke damage was real. It had always been real, but within 3 months she had recovered a level of speech and cognitive function that her regular neurologist, now deeply and visibly shaken, said he could not fully account for under his previous assessments. She could hold a conversation. She could tell me things. She could tell me things I needed to know, and some things I wish I didn't. She told me she had known something was wrong for a long time, that there were periods when she felt more present, more aware, and that in those periods she had tried to communicate and hadn't been able to make it understood. She told me about a night when she heard her brother in the kitchen, talking on the phone. She couldn't make out the words clearly, but she knew his voice, and she knew something was wrong in the tone of it, the hushed, quick urgency. She told me she had tried to tell me. She had tried. I sat next to her bed in Durham while she told me this, and I held her hand, and I didn't say anything for a very long time. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate. I had been in the house. I had been there. I had been taking care of her, and I had not seen it, and she had been trying to tell me, and I hadn't understood. That is the weight I will carry for the rest of my life, and I am not asking anyone to lift it from me. It is mine. The legal proceedings took 14 months. My wife's brother pleaded guilty to financial fraud, elder abuse, a designation that applied because of my wife's incapacitation, and a charge related to the illegal administration of a controlled substance. The notary cooperated with the prosecution and received a reduced sentence. The attorney who handled the fraudulent transfers claimed ignorance, and that case is still making its way through the system. We recovered approximately $260,000 of the transferred assets. The rest had been spent on a commercial development project that failed, on personal debt, on the gap between what he needed and what he was willing to admit he needed. That money is gone. My wife's attorney is still pursuing certain civil avenues, and I have been told to maintain cautious optimism, which is a phrase I have come to find very nearly useless. My older son did not speak to his uncle for 11 months after the arrest. My younger son, who has always been the one who wears his anger visibly, said at Thanksgiving the year after that he would never be in the same room as his uncle again. I told him I understood. I also told him, when he was calmer, that carrying that kind of permanent door slamming in your chest will cost him more than it cost his uncle, and that I wasn't saying it to be forgiving. I was saying it because I was 64 years old and I had learned something about the cost of long-term rage. He listened. I don't know if he agreed. My wife came home, our home, 14 months after she was transferred to Durham. She could walk short distances with a cane. She could speak clearly enough that we could have dinner conversations, slow ones, the kind where you have to listen fully and not just wait for your turn. She could not manage stairs reliably, so we converted the downstairs office into a bedroom, which we had already done years earlier, and so the adjustment was familiar. She could not return to any kind of work. She probably never will. What I want to tell you, the thing I most want to say, and the thing I found hardest to understand during the worst of it, is that the man who committed this crime against her was not a stranger. He was not some external predator who found a vulnerability and exploited it. He was someone who had known her entire life. He had held her at their mother's funeral. He had been in the delivery room, or close to it, when our boys were born. He had loved her, I believe, in the incomplete way that people sometimes love the people they damage. That does not excuse a single thing he did. But it matters for understanding how something like this happens inside a family, behind closed doors, under the roof of a house where someone who loved her was present every single day. People sometimes ask me, carefully, the way people ask careful questions, whether I blame myself. And the honest answer, the one I stopped polishing a long time ago, is yes. Not for what he did. That belongs entirely to him. But for the blindness, for the exhaustion that became a kind of tunnel vision. For the way I trusted the care system around her without ever stepping outside it long enough to ask whether the system itself was broken. I was so focused on keeping her alive and cared for and comfortable that I stopped asking whether comfortable was all she actually was. Dr. Finnick, the neurologist from Durham who came to our house and changed everything, sent me a note about a year after the criminal case was resolved. It was handwritten, 3 paragraphs. In it, he said that the instinct that made him reach out directly rather than just filing his observations with her medical record was something he almost overrode. He said he'd second-guessed himself in the parking lot before he even came in. I think about that sometimes. How close we came to the note going in a file, the file going in a system, the system doing nothing in particular with it. How close I came to reading to her for another 2 years while her brother finished what he'd started. I was 63 when that Tuesday morning happened. I am 66 now. My wife is 61. We sit on the back porch in the evenings when the weather allows it, which in Wilmington is more often than not. She reads more slowly than she used to. I still walk too fast for a man with nowhere to be, and she still tells me so. Last spring, my younger son came down from Charlotte with his daughter, our granddaughter, who is 5 years old and has her great-grandmother's fearlessness and her grandmother's particular way of looking at you like she's already figured out more than she's letting on. She climbed up onto the porch step and looked at my wife very seriously and said, "Grammy, what are you reading?" My wife told her the title. Our granddaughter thought about it. Then she said, "Is it good?" And my wife said, "Yes, it's very good," and reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind our granddaughter's ear, with her right hand, slowly, carefully. The way she does everything now. I had to go inside for a minute. There are things I will never get back. The 4 years of fuller recovery that might have been possible, the money that is gone. The version of our marriage that existed before I understood what had been happening inside it. The ease I used to feel when I assumed that the people around us meant us no harm. But I watched my wife tuck that little girl's hair back, and I thought, she is here. After everything, the stroke, the drugs, the 4 years of someone else deciding how much of herself she was allowed to be, she's still here, still reading, still correcting my pace, still, in the slow and limited way that is now her way, herself. That's what I have. It's not everything we had. But I am 66 years old, and I have learned that not everything is not the same as nothing, and I have learned it from someone who would know. The thing about my wife's brother that I keep coming back to, not in anger anymore, but in something closer to exhausted understanding, is that he wasn't born doing this. Nobody is. What he had was a hole in him that had been there a long time, and he made a series of choices, each one a little worse than the last, until the choices made him into someone who would drug his own sister to keep her quiet while he emptied her bank accounts. That's how it works. It's never one large decision. It's 100 small ones, each easier than it should have been because the previous one already moved the line. I think about that when I think about what I could have done differently. The blindness I carried wasn't laziness. It was grief wearing the mask of devotion. I was so certain I was doing right by my wife that I never stopped to ask whether right was enough. There is a kind of intelligence that only comes from stepping outside the story you're living inside, from asking the uncomfortable question even when you're exhausted, even when you trust the people around you, even when questioning feels like a betrayal of that trust. Dr. Fennick had it. He sat in a parking lot and almost talked himself out of it. And then he walked in anyway. That clear-headedness, the willingness to see what's actually in front of you instead of what you expect to be there, that is not a gift some people have and others don't. It is a discipline. It is something you practice even when it costs you something. My wife practiced it every day of those 4 years in ways I didn't recognize until she told me. She was aware. She was trying. She was fighting from inside a body that someone had deliberately made into a cage, and she kept pushing against the bars anyway. That kind of endurance. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that gets witnessed and praised, but the quiet, daily, completely invisible kind. That is what actually holds a life together when everything else fails. I have more respect for it now than I know how to say. In the moral weight of what her brother did, I don't think he has finished reckoning with it yet. Maybe he never will. But I have noticed in the years since that the people who carry the least integrity over a lifetime tend to end up with the least of everything else too, not as punishment from somewhere outside themselves. Just as consequence. When you build your life on what you can take from people who trust you, there is eventually nothing left to stand on. That is not a spiritual law. It is just arithmetic. I am 66 years old. I have my wife back in ways I was told not to expect. I have 2 sons who are, in their different ways, good men. I have a granddaughter who asks good questions, and I have, for the first time in a long time, a clear-eyed understanding of what actually matters and what I am willing to fight to protect. That clarity costs more than I would ever have agreed to pay. But it is mine now, and I don't intend to waste it.